Marcos and Julia met in 8th grade at a typical high school in the small town of Springfield, United States. From the first glance, something indescribable happened. They were only 14 and 15 years old, respectively, but they already felt that unique connection that few experience in life. The beginning of their relationship was marked by laughter, sunset bike rides, and promises of eternal love. Marcos was the kind of boy who did everything to see Julia smile. He remembered every detail, the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about her dreams. As they entered high school, their bond only grew stronger. They faced the challenges of exams, graduation, and career decisions always hand in hand. Friends and teachers saw them as the perfect couple, destined to be together forever. Marcos, with his calm and determined demeanor, always knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Julia. Julia, with her vibrant energy and determination, always believed their future would be bright. After high school, they decided together which college to attend, leading them to Boston University. They spent 4 intense years studying, partying, and making plans for the future. In the summer of their graduation, both were ready for the next step. Julia would start graduate school in psychology in their hometown, while Marcos had accepted a promising job in the university town, 6 hours away. Despite the distance, Marcos and Julia were determined to make the relationship work. 1 year is nothing, Marcos said convincingly. They planned that after this period, he would move back to their hometown and they would start a new chapter together. However, as the summer progressed, something changed. Julia began to behave strangely, distant. Marcos felt a tightening in his heart every time she abruptly hung up the phone or responded to his messages with coldness. He tried to convince himself it was just the stress of graduate school, but deep down, a shadow of worry began to form. During a visit at the end of the summer, Julia suggested they should take a break. Marcos, desperate, tried to argue, but nothing seemed to convince her. The pain was unbearable and he found himself crying, something he never imagined doing. Seeing Marcos's tears made Julia briefly reconsider, but his relief was short-lived. Weeks later, Julia made it clear she didn't want to speak to him anymore. "I love you, but I'm not in love with you," she said, her words cutting Marcos's heart like a sharp blade. Devastated, Marcos felt the weight of 8.5 years of memories crushing his spirit. He said goodbye and walked away, feeling as if a part of himself had been torn away. The pain was constant, an open wound that seemed not to heal. Thus began the story of Marcos and Julia, a love story that would face the cruelest trials. The reader feels Marcos's anguish, his hopelessness, and his fear of what is to come. At every step, he struggles against the pain, trying to find a way through the darkness that now envelops his heart. Marcos was trying to adjust to the new reality of living without Julia. Each day felt like a struggle, and every minute without her was an eternity. He threw himself into work, trying to fill the void she had left. But the nights were unbearable. He would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, reliving every moment they had spent together. Her absence was a black hole, sucking all the light and joy out of his life. Julia, on the other hand, was also struggling. Even though she was surrounded by family and busy with her graduate studies, something was broken inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about Marcos, the promises they made, and the future they planned. However, an invisible pressure kept her distant. She felt something was wrong but couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. During a visit to their hometown, the tension between them became palpable. Julia was strangely cold and distant. They met at a cafe they used to frequent, but the conversation was disjointed, full of uncomfortable silences. Julia suggested with a trembling voice that maybe they should take a break. Marcos felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. He looked at her, trying to find in her eyes the girl he loved, but all he saw was a painful emptiness. "We can't give up like this," Marcos said, his voice heavy with desperation. "We promised we'd make this work." Julia looked away, tears beginning to form. "I know, Marcos, but it's so hard. I feel like we're drifting further and further apart." Marcos held her hand, trying to convey all the love and pain he felt through his touch. "I love you, Julia. I don't want to lose you." Seeing Marcos's tears broke Julia's heart. She agreed to try once more, but the uncertainty hung in the air like a dark cloud. Marcos returned to the university town with a temporary sense of relief, but the shadow of doubt continued to haunt him. The weeks that followed were tormenting. Julia grew even more distant, the messages became less frequent, and when they did talk, Her irritability was evident. Marcos couldn't understand what was happening. Every conversation left a bitter taste, and he felt powerless, unable to bring the light back into their relationship. One day while at work, Marcos received a message from Julia. She wanted to talk. His heart raced. When he called her, Julia was direct. "I can't do this anymore, Marcos. I love you, but I'm not in love with you." The pain in Julia's voice was undeniable, but it didn't lessen the devastation Marcos felt. He tried to argue, tried to understand, but Julia was determined. "It's better for both of us," she said, trying to sound resolute, but her voice trembled. Marcos hung up, feeling lost and alone. He didn't know how to move on. The life he knew had been shattered, and he had no idea how to put the pieces back together. Every memory of Julia, every photo, every message, was a cruel reminder of the love he had lost. The shadow of something more sinister loomed in the air, something Marcos couldn't yet understand. Julia was hiding something, a painful truth that when revealed would change everything. The uncertainty and pain were overwhelming, and the reader feels the weight of this growing anguish. The persistent question is, what is really happening? What is Julia hiding? And how will Marcos withstand this new storm that is approaching? Marcos was at rock bottom. The pain of the breakup was still fresh, and he felt lost without Julia. He decided to make one last attempt at reconciliation, driving to her hometown to try to talk face to face. When he arrived, he found the house full of relatives, all gathered for a family event. He was nervous but determined to speak with Julia. While waiting in the yard, David, Julia's cousin, approached him. David had always been a dark figure, someone Marcos never really understood. There was something in his eyes, a malice that made Marcos uncomfortable. David started talking, initially with a casual tone, but soon the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Marcos, I think it's time you knew the truth," David said, with a sinister smile. "Do you think you can just show up here and try to fix things? Julia deserves better." Marcos frowned, not understanding. "What are you talking about, David?" Then David dropped a bombshell. He accused Marcos of something horrible, something he could never have imagined. He claimed to have proof that Marcos had cheated on Julia with another woman. The accusation was false, but it was said with such conviction that Marcos was left speechless. "You think no one knows?" David continued, his voice dripping with venom. "Julia already knows, and the whole family is against you. You'd better leave before things get worse." Marcos, stunned and in shock, tried to defend himself, but David's words were sharp and filled with hatred. He felt like he was sinking into an endless nightmare. Before he could fully process what was happening, Julia appeared, her eyes filled with tears. "Is it true, Marcos?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you really do this?" Marcos, his heart racing, vehemently denied it. "No, Julia, I would never do that. You have to believe me." But Julia was devastated. David's words had planted a deep doubt, and the family's pressure was overwhelming. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said, turning and going back into the house, leaving Marcos alone in the yard, feeling betrayed and desperate. Julia's family turned against him, as if all the memories of the past 8 years had been erased by this cruel lie. The pain of rejection was unbearable. Marcos saw Julia's mother, who had always treated him kindly, now looking at him with disdain. Her father, who had considered him almost like a son, now saw him as a disappointment. Marcos left, his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. He felt like he was in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. David's false accusation had destroyed not only his relationship with Julia, but also the trust and respect her family had for him. The sense of injustice burned in his chest, a deep, unrelenting pain. On the way home, he felt crushed by the weight of betrayal and lies. Tears streamed down his face and he screamed in frustration, not understanding how his life had fallen apart so quickly. He knew he needed to prove his innocence, but at that moment, everything felt lost. The reader feels Marcos's intense pain, the anguish of being falsely accused, and the hopelessness of having lost everything he loved. The question now is, how will he overcome this injustice? What will happen when the truth comes out? Marcos returned to his life in the university town with an unbearable weight on his heart. David's false accusation echoed in his mind like a cruel mantra. He felt trapped in a web of lies and injustice, unable to find a way out. The days dragged on painfully. Marcos tried to focus on work, the gym, anything that could distract him from the excruciating pain he felt. He couldn't sleep properly, his mind always drifting back to the happy moments he had shared with Julia and the betrayal he had experienced. At first, he withdrew from everything and everyone. He avoided places he used to go with Julia, the songs she loved, anything that brought back memories of her. Every little detail hurt like a stab in the chest. Over time, however, Marcos realized he needed to move on. He started going to the gym regularly, not just to improve his physical health, but also as a way to release the frustration and anger he felt. He made new friends, people who knew nothing about his life with Julia, people who saw him as he was now, not as he used to be with her. As the months passed, Marcos gradually began to rebuild his life. He found a new balance, learning to live without Julia by his side. But the scar left by the betrayal still burned deeply. He wondered incessantly how everything had fallen apart so quickly, how he could have been so naive as not to notice what was happening. Meanwhile, Julia was facing her own internal battles. The decision to distance herself from Marcos haunted her every moment. She tried to convince herself it was for the best, but the guilt consumed her. She knew she couldn't simply erase 8.5 years of love and happy memories. Every memory of Marcos made her question her own decisions. She tried to focus on her studies, on her family, on anything but the pain she felt. But Marcos's absence was like a shadow that followed her everywhere. She missed him in a way that was almost physical, as if a part of her had been ripped away. Sometimes Julia wanted to call Marcos, to explain everything, to apologize for being so hasty. But fear paralyzed her. What if it was too late? What if he had already moved on? She tortured herself with these thoughts every night as she struggled to find some semblance of inner peace. Meanwhile, life continued for both of them, separately. Marcos continued his journey of self-discovery and rebuilding. He realized that despite the unbearable pain, there was an opportunity to grow and strengthen himself. The pain transformed him, shaping him in ways he never imagined possible. And Julia, despite her confusion and regret, also began to change. She realized she needed to face the consequences of her actions, that she needed to find a way to correct the mistakes she had made. The truth, though painful, began to emerge slowly, like a ray of sunshine breaking through dark clouds. Both were on a path of growth and self-discovery, separated by miles but united by a love story that refused to be forgotten. The reader feels the intensity of Marcos and Julia's emotional journey, their internal struggles, and the fragile hope that begins to sprout on the horizon. The question now is, will they be able to find their way back to each other? And what will happen when the hidden truths finally come to light? While Marcos and Julia tried to move on separately, fate was preparing a twist that would change everything. Marcos continued his daily routine, trying to keep his mind busy and his heart protected. He dedicated himself to work, friends, and new hobbies he had discovered. Each day was a step toward healing, but the shadow of the past still hung over him. One afternoon, while at the gym, Marcos received an unexpected call. It was from an unknown number. He answered cautiously, having no idea who it could be. "Marcos?" The voice on the other end was familiar but filled with emotion. "Yes, who is this?" Marcos asked, his heart racing. "It's me, Julia," said the trembling voice. "We need to talk." Marcos felt a whirlwind of emotions. Julia's voice stirred painful memories but also a spark of hope. He agreed to meet her the next day at a cafe near the campus. The next morning, Marcos was nervous and anxious. He arrived early at the cafe, his heart pounding in his chest. When Julia walked in, he immediately saw the sadness in her eyes, but also the determination on her face. They sat at a secluded table, surrounded by the soft murmur of other patrons. The silence between them was tense, laden with years of unresolved history. "I'm so sorry, Marcos," Julia began, her voice wavering. "I made a huge mistake." Marcos looked at her, not knowing what to expect. His heart was torn between the pain of the past and the hope for a future he thought he had lost forever. "David, he lied," Julia continued, tears now streaming down her face. "He made up that story, that horrible accusation. He was jealous and wanted to separate us." The revelation hit Marcos like a punch to the stomach. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. For months, he had carried the weight of a guilt that wasn't his. The injustice was overwhelming. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Marcos asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Julia sobbed, struggling to find the words. "I was so scared, Marcos. Scared of losing you forever. Scared that you couldn't forgive me." Marcos looked into her eyes, seeing the sincerity and remorse. In an instant, the barriers he had built around his heart crumbled. All the love and pain he felt for her came flooding back, overwhelming him like a tide. "I forgive you, Julia," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I forgive you." And in that moment, they knew they couldn't live apart anymore. The love they shared was stronger than any lie, more powerful than any obstacle. Marcos and Julia embraced, their tears mingling in a hug that transcended lost time. The reader feels the redemption, the overwhelming emotion of a sincere forgiveness, and the rebirth of a love that had withstood the hardest test. From that day on, Marcos and Julia began to rebuild their relationship, stronger than ever. They faced challenges together, learning from past mistakes and strengthening their bond every day. The reader is moved by the journey of forgiveness, growth, and the renewal of true love. And so, the story of Marcos and Julia turned into a saga of overcoming adversity and a love that conquers all obstacles. They learned that even in the darkest hours, love can be the light that guides the way home. Marcos and Julia embarked on a journey of rebuilding, restoring not only their relationship, but also the trust and love that had been shaken by David's lies. Each day was an opportunity to reconnect, to rediscover what they had lost during those painful months of separation. However, the path was not easy. They faced challenges stemming from the scar left by David's lie. Julia's family, who had initially rejected Marcos, needed to be won over again. They struggled to understand and forgive, but the wounds were still fresh. Marcos battled his own inner demons. The shadow of the unjust accusation still hung over him, sometimes causing him to question his own self-worth and value. He worked hard to overcome the emotional trauma he had suffered, finding solace in Julia's love and support. Julia, in turn, was determined to make peace with her past and build a solid future with Marcos. She strived to make up for lost time, to prove to Marcos that his trust would never be shaken again. Every gesture, every word was a reminder of the deep commitment she felt for him. Together, they explored new experiences, created new memories, and strengthened their bond through open and honest communication. They learned to value each moment together, knowing that true love required hard work and continuous commitment. However, not everything was perfect. They faced doubts and uncertainties about the future. The past still cast a shadow over them, and they knew that the journey to complete healing would be long and challenging. But they were determined to face these challenges together, side by side. As time passed, Marcos and Julia began to glimpse a bright future. They dreamed of a life together, with all the ups and downs that entailed. The reader is moved by their resilience, by the strength of a love that transcended all adversities. And so, the story of Marcos and Julia became a testament to forgiveness, redemption, and hope. They discovered that even in the depths of pain and distrust, true love could flourish and thrive. They learned that the past does not define the future, and that together they could face any challenge life presented them. With each page of this moving story, the reader is taken on an emotional roller coaster, navigating the highs and lows of a romance that captures the essence of true love. And the final question that remains is, what does the future hold for Marcos and Julia now that they have finally found their way back to each other? Marcos and Julia face the future with a mix of hope and apprehension. Despite having rebuilt their relationship and strengthened their bond, there were still challenges to face and decisions to be made. They talked about their dreams and plans, imagining a future together. Marcos still had a year left on his contract in the university town, while Julia was halfway through her graduate program in her hometown. The physical distance remained an obstacle, but they were determined to overcome it. Marcos began to consider his options for the future. He loved his job, but knew he would eventually have to decide between advancing his career or moving closer to Julia. Each option had its own consequences, and he wondered if he could find a balance between his professional ambitions and his relationship with Julia. Julia, on the other hand, was committed to her studies and completing her program. She had plans to pursue a career in her hometown, where she had a strong family support network. The idea of moving to the university town was tempting, but she also recognized the difficulties and sacrifices it would entail. As they faced these decisions, Marcos and Julia continued to support each other. They knew that whatever choice they made, they would face it together. Their love was an anchor in the midst of uncertainty, a source of comfort and strength. However, fate had one more surprise in store for them. During a visit by Julia to the university town, Marcos surprised her with a romantic gesture that would change their lives forever. He took her to the park where they used to walk together during their early years of dating, a place full of memories and meaning. There, at sunset, with the gentle sound of birds and the scent of flowers in the air, Marcos knelt before Julia. He took a small box out of his pocket, his heart pounding with nervousness and excitement. "Julia, you are my life, my love. I can't imagine a future without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Julia's face as she looked at Marcos, her heart overflowing with love and happiness. She couldn't find words, only nodding her head, her eyes shining with the certainty that she had found her destiny. And so, amid uncertainties and challenges, Marcos and Julia found the promise of a future together. They knew there would be ups and downs, tough decisions, and sacrifices to make. But they also knew that the love they shared was strong enough to face anything life threw at them. As the sun set on the horizon, Marcos slipped the ring onto Julia's finger, sealing his promise of eternal love. The reader shares in the emotion of this unique moment, the beauty of reconciliation, and the renewed hope for Marcos and Julia's future. And so ends the story of Marcos and Julia, a journey of love, forgiveness, and growth. The reader is left with the certainty that even in the darkest moments, true love can find its way back to the light.